Welcome to the New Hampshire Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence LibGuide. If you are watching this video, then you have found the LibGuide and are probably feeling a little overwhelmed and want to know where to start with the information that's contained here. So this is just a brief overview to provide some context on how best to utilize the tools listed in this LibGuide. So why are we talking about domestic violence and sexual assault, and why are we talking about them together? So a lot of the resources in New Hampshire are combined to service both domestic violence victims and sexual assault victims. So therefore, it makes the most sense to give information that provides resources for both populations. So what is domestic violence? The Oxford Dictionary defines it as violent or aggressive behavior within the home, typically involving the violent abuse of a spouse or partner. You can see below that I've listed the Department of Justice's definition, and I did this for one of two reasons. One, it provides a bigger context for those who aren't as familiar with domestic violence, and two, it also highlights the fact that we have a little bit of a ways to catch up with what we think of as domestic violence and as a culture and society and personally. The Department of Justice expands on domestic violence, not necessarily just occurring in the home between a spouse or partner, but then goes on to discuss how it is to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner, and lists the different ways that this can occur, which is physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions or threats of actions that influence another person. So you can see here with the Department of Justice's explanation, it also talks about the threat of action. So while there may not be an action occurring, such as the taking of a wallet, if we're talking about economic things, or the taking of a paycheck, it could be the threat of doing that, and this is to hold power over the victim. So sexual assault, Oxford Dictionary defines it as the action or an act of forcing an unconsenting person to engage in sexual activity, a rape, a crime involving forced sexual contact, variously defined as inclusive or exclusive of rape. Now, their definition is a little bit confusing and very limiting. The Department of Justice defines it as sexual assault is any type of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient. So this goes on to include maybe a situation that occurs where a party is incapacitated via alcohol or drugs and is incapable of making consent. It also furthers the idea that we should be working towards explicit consent, which is this idea that when you are giving consent, silence or a head nod, things that could be misconstrued are not necessarily consent, but a verbal yes, or yes, I consent to this specific act, is where we should be headed with consent. So why do you need to know about this as a librarian? The next couple slides are some statistics about specifically our state of New Hampshire. So in our state, 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted. 41% of those were reported before the age of 18, and 83% of sexual assaults occur before the age of 25. So when you're thinking about the demographics of your library, chances are you have populations that fit into this, and therefore you are already servicing people who have been or are at risk to be sexually assaulted. And then 1 in 20 men in New Hampshire have reported sexual assault, and 68% of those assaults occurred before their 18th birthday. So again, this is not just a women's issue, this is not just women victims. Anyone can be a victim of sexual assault, and it's really important that when we are servicing our patrons, we are also challenging any personal bias we may have or personal thoughts we may have about what a sexual assault victim looks like, and really trying to expand that to understand that anyone can be the victim of a sexual assault at any point in their life. These are statistics about sexual assaults and the services that our New Hampshire crisis centers have done. So 2,380 adult victims of sexual assault were serviced by our New Hampshire crisis centers last year. 669 adult victims of stalking were served by the crisis centers. And then 404 victims of child abuse were served by our New Hampshire crisis centers. 754 victims of child sexual abuse were served in 2016 by our New Hampshire crisis centers. and 243 children were exposed to domestic violence and were serviced by our New Hampshire Crisis Centers in 2016. I think this statistic is worth mentioning, that there are a lot of new programs in our state, specifically in Concord and Manchester. They're really trying to find kind of the children who are falling through the loopholes with exposure to domestic violence, because there are studies that exposure can lead to further issues later on in life. And so really trying to target as a state the victims who, specifically child victims who are exposed to domestic violence, and getting them the services that they need when they need them. So that's a pretty interesting and new development with our crisis centers in New Hampshire. The last thing I want to touch on is the terminology used in this LibGuide. To streamline it, I have some terminology in here that is worth noting, and also just some other caveats about using language with patrons in your library. So throughout the guide, I'm going to have DV/SA listed. This is mostly to reduce clutter of constantly writing domestic violence and sexual assault. So this is just an acronym that's used pretty heavily in the field, and it just refers to domestic violence and sexual assault. So I've used it in places where either services are provided for both populations, or they both share a similar element or a similar statistic. This is not to say that domestic violence and sexual assault are the same thing, that they occur to the same people, that they have the same risk factors or effects on an individual. This is just simply to save space for typing out domestic violence and sexual assault. The other thing I want to touch on is the use of victim and survivor as terms that we use towards people who have experienced domestic violence and sexual assault. I use these terms interchangeably in the LibGuide, and victim in this LibGuide tends to focus more on people who have just experienced an assault or domestic violence, and survivor is maybe a little bit further down their recovery road. But I just want to reiterate that language is really important, and I think we all know that language is really important. And so if you are working with someone, or you're working with a patron or a friend in your personal life, and they are talking about themselves as a victim, or they are talking about themselves as a survivor, it is up to them on how they want to label their experience, and we should be mimicking that, not labeling them. So if we have someone who is calling themselves a survivor, constantly referring to them as a victim is reinforcing the cultural stereotypes that these experiences kind of define oneself forever. So just be cautious about the language you use, and try to mimic the usage of language that victims and survivors use when they talk about their experience. The same thing goes for how they label their experience. They may say they were sexually assaulted. They may say they were raped. They may say that, something happened. So really trying to just understand that they are the authors of their own life, and the language that they want to use to describe their experience is what we should also be using. We don't want to put labels on them. We don't want to tell them that something happened to them that they are not comfortable with that terminology. And then I threw in crisis centers in case anyone is not familiar with them, so I just wanted to list some of the services that they offer. And crisis center just refers to the organizations in our state that service domestic violence and sexual assault victims. And these crisis centers offer a variety of services, and these services vary within institutions and organizations. So the things I have listed may not be offered in your area. So it's really important to check out, and I have it listed under the DVSA resources for patrons, the specific county by county service populations that the crisis centers serve. So it's worth taking a look at the crisis center that is located near your public library, and the one that's or academic library or special library, and looking at the services that they have to offer, so that if you are presented with the opportunity to give a patron some services or give them some information, that your information is correct. But some of the things that crisis centers offer is, of course, they have a 24/7 crisis line if anyone's in distress. This is not just for people who have, just immediately experienced an assault or domestic violence. This can be an ongoing process. Sometimes people are triggered by things that occur and they need to call the crisis line. So the crisis line's 24/7. There is one for the state as well. So if your local crisis center, if you can't find that phone number, there is a statewide one as well. They also offer counseling services where you can go and meet with an advocate kind of process. They have emergency shelter and homelessness shelter, which those are the two things that really vary by organization, so it's worth looking into that. They also have assistance with filing court documents, so if that's a stalking petition, a domestic violence petition, going to the follow-up hearings, there's advocates available to assist victims and survivors with the court process, which could also include the location of lawyer services. And then the advocates also assist at the courts, hospitals, and police stations for victims or survivors who are either filing reports or are getting maybe a rape kit done by a SANE nurse, which is specially trained sexual assault nurse examiners. So you can have an advocate with you at all of those points. So with this overview, please take some time to process the information and proceed through the LiveGuide as you see fit for yourself.